Good evening, generals, and welcome to a new episode of Men Around the Führer. Berlin, May 1st, 1945. The Reich Chancellery bunker reeked of diesel fumes and human decay, while Adolf Hitler's charred remains smoldered in a shallow crater above. His Minister of Food and Agriculture sat in an adjoining chamber, methodically writing his final administrative memoranda. Herbert Backe, the man who had engineered the starvation of millions, was still optimizing supply chains as Soviet artillery pulverized the city into rubble. 22 days later, British soldiers arrested him in Flensburg, along with the remnants of the Donetsk government. He surrendered without resistance, but the documents he carried revealed something the Nuremberg prosecutors weren't prepared for. The Holocaust's logistics had a twin. A deliberate, calculated famine that killed more than 4 million Soviet civilians. And unlike the gas chambers, this genocide was committed with spreadsheets, crop forecasts, and railway timetables. Herbert Backe never pulled a trigger. He never walked through Auschwitz, but his signature on a single policy document, the Hunger Plan, condemned millions to death by starvation. The Allies called him one of the greatest criminals of the war. Then, before he could testify, he hanged himself in his cell. His secrets died with him, until the archives were declassified. This is the story of the bureaucrat who weaponized hunger, and why his name has been deliberately erased from history. To understand Herbert Backe, you must first understand what he was not. He wasn't a sadistic camp commandant. He didn't deliver speeches about racial purity at Nuremberg rallies. He wasn't even a member of the SS until 1933, after the Nazis seized power. Herbert Backe was something far more dangerous. A technocrat, an agricultural economist who believed that mass death could be reduced to a logistical equation. Feed the Wehrmacht, starve the Untermenschen, maximize efficiency. Born in Batumi, Georgia, on May 1, 1896, Backe grew up in the volatile Caucasus region, Russian territory saturated with ethnic tensions and revolutionary violence. His father, a retired Prussian lieutenant turned merchant, operated in a world where Germans maintained distinct commercial enclaves. When World War I erupted in 1914, young Herbert, then studying at the Tbilisi Gymnasium, was interned as an enemy alien, a German citizen trapped in Russia as the empire collapsed. He witnessed the Russian Revolution's beginning, the Bolshevik seizures, the violence against perceived class enemies, the chaos that consumed the old order. Whether through direct trauma or absorbed hatred, Backe developed a pathological loathing of Slavic peoples and communism that would define his career 25 years later. He escaped to Germany during the Russian Civil War with help from the Swedish Red Cross, worked as a laborer, enrolled at the University of Göttingen in 1920 to study agronomy, became an expert in land reform, soil science, and population sustainability. By the mid-1920s, he was publishing research on autarky, the theory that Germany could achieve food self-sufficiency through territorial expansion and scientific farming. In 1926, he submitted his doctoral dissertation to Göttingen, The Russian Grain Economy as the Basis of Russian Agriculture. It was rejected. The thesis was, in essence, a manifesto for racial imperialism, arguing that German occupiers could and should control food resources from ethnically inferior populations. After Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Backe self-published 10,000 copies and distributed them to occupation administrators. The Nazis read his work. They liked what they saw. In 1922, Backe joined the SA. 1925, the Nazi Party. Not out of ideological fervor, but cold pragmatism. He recognized that Hitler's regime would need agricultural specialists to fulfill its territorial ambitions. By October 1933, months after the Nazi seizure of power, he was state secretary in the Ministry of Food and Agriculture. He joined the SS the same month. His rise was methodical, bloodless, inevitable. But it was in 1941, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, that Backe's true purpose crystallized. The planning began as soon as Hitler announced his intention to invade the Soviet Union in December 1940. Wehrmacht strategists faced an impossible logistics problem. How to feed 3 million soldiers in a hostile agrarian wasteland, thousands of kilometers from German supply lines. The answer was brutal in its honesty. The invasion force would have to live off the land, which meant the Soviet population would have to die. Herbert Backe was summoned to provide the agricultural calculus. On May 2, 1941, 7 weeks before Barbarossa launched, senior German officials convened a classified meeting of state secretaries in Berlin. Representatives from every major ministry attended. Wehrmacht Economics Chief General Georg Thomas, officials from Göring's four-year plan office, and Herbert Backe, speaking for the Ministry of Food and Agriculture. The minutes of that meeting contain one of the most chilling sentences in 20th century history. The war can only be continued if the entire Wehrmacht is fed from Russia in the third year of the war. If we take what we need out of the country, there can be no doubt that tens of millions of people will die of starvation. This wasn't a warning. It was policy. Backe delivered the core assessment. The Soviet Union produced enough grain to feed its population and export surplus. But if Germany seized Ukraine, Belarus, and the grain-producing regions of southern Russia, those crops could be redirected to the Wehrmacht and the German home front. The cost, 20 to 30 million Soviet citizens would starve to death. Backe didn't propose this as a hypothetical. He mandated it as operational doctrine. The plan specified which regions would be stripped of food: Leningrad, Moscow, the industrial cities of the Urals. The populations were classified into tiers. Tier 1, German soldiers and administrators, full rations. Tier 2, Soviet laborers working for the Reich, minimum subsistence. Tier 3, everyone else, 0 calories. They were termed surplus eaters, expendable population whose deaths would free up resources for Germans. 3 weeks later, on May 23, 1941, Hans Joachim Rieke's agricultural section of the Economic Staff East finalized the document. It became known as Göring's Green Folder, a policy directive that stated, "The feeding of the German people stands first among the claims on the occupied territories." Hermann Göring signed it. Adolf Hitler approved it. Herbert Backe had engineered it. The hunger plan was never just about feeding the Wehrmacht. It was about ethnic restructuring. Backe explicitly argued that the starvation of the Slavic population would create Lebensraum, living space, for future German settlers. The deaths weren't a regrettable side effect. They were the objective. And unlike the final solution, which required secrecy and euphemism, the hunger plan was implemented in broad daylight. June 22, 1941. 3 million Wehrmacht soldiers crossed the Soviet border. Within weeks, they controlled Ukraine's breadbasket. Backe's apparatus moved in behind them. He established the Central Trading Company East, Zentrale Handelsgesellschaft Ost, a pseudo-commercial entity that functioned as the Reich's food extraction machine. Its mandate: seize every ton of grain, every head of livestock, every kilogram of potatoes. Local populations were forbidden from retaining food stocks. Farmers who hid grain were shot. Villages that resisted were burned. But Backe's innovation wasn't just confiscation. It was infrastructure sabotage. His teams systematically destroyed Soviet grain storage facilities, mills, and railways, not to cripple the Red Army, but to prevent civilians from accessing food, even if the Wehrmacht retreated. The goal was to render entire regions uninhabitable. Scorched earth, but in reverse. The results were catastrophic. By December 1941, Leningrad was encircled. The city's food reserves were exhausted. Backe's agents had already seized the surrounding farmland. The population, 3 million civilians, began to die at a rate of 4,000 per day. Mothers boiled leather belts to feed their children. Cannibalism became so widespread that the NKVD created special police units to hunt down flesh eaters. The siege lasted 900 days. 1 million Leningraders starved to death. Backe monitored the situation from Berlin. His reports noted the satisfactory reduction in surplus population. In Ukraine, the toll was even worse. The Wehrmacht requisitioned 80% of the 1941 harvest. Backe's economists calculated that this would result in millions of deaths by starvation and disease. They were correct. By the end of 1942, entire villages were depopulated. Soviet partisans later found hamlets where the only signs of life were the corpses of children too weak to flee. The hunger plan achieved its objective in the occupied territories, but it failed strategically because Herbert Backe made a fatal miscalculation. Backe's plan assumed the Soviet Union would collapse within 6 months. Blitzkrieg would decapitate the regime. The Red Army would disintegrate. The civilian population would be too starved and demoralized to resist. But the Soviet Union didn't collapse. It fought. By winter 1941, the Wehrmacht was stalled outside Moscow. The hunger plan's logistics began to unravel. The grain that Backe had promised to German cities wasn't arriving. Why? Because the infrastructure he'd destroyed to starve Soviet civilians also crippled the Reich's supply lines. Railways were sabotaged. Grain elevators were bombed by retreating Red Army units. The Ukrainian harvest that was supposed to feed Germany rotted in fields because there weren't enough trains to transport it. Meanwhile, the Soviet population adapted. Partisans raided German supply depots. Civilians fled to the forests and subsisted on roots, bark, and stolen Wehrmacht rations. The NKVD organized underground food distribution networks. Stalin's regime, brutal as it was, prioritized feeding the Red Army and urban workers. The rural population was sacrificed, but not entirely. Enough survived to continue resistance. Backe responded with escalation. In 1942, he proposed expanding the hunger plan to include Soviet prisoners of war. 3.3 million Red Army soldiers were already in German captivity. Backe argued they should be classified as surplus eaters and left to starve in open-air camps. The Wehrmacht complied. By February 1943, 2 million Soviet POWs had died of starvation and exposure. The survivors were so emaciated that when the Allies liberated the camps in 1945, they initially mistook them for concentration camp inmates. But even this atrocity backfired. The Red Army, hearing reports of POW deaths, fought with suicidal ferocity. Surrender rates plummeted. Soviet soldiers chose death in battle over capture. The Wehrmacht's casualty rates skyrocketed. The Eastern Front became a meat grinder. By 1943, Backe's hunger plan was a strategic disaster. Germany was losing the war. The home front was starving, and the man responsible for feeding the Reich had engineered a famine that consumed his own people. What kind of man signs a document condemning millions to death? Herbert Backe was not insane. Psychiatric evaluations conducted after his capture described him as rational, methodical, and emotionally detached. He didn't hate his victims in the way Julius Streicher hated Jews. He simply didn't regard them as relevant. To Backe, Soviet civilians were statistical abstractions, variables in an equation. The hunger plan wasn't an act of sadism. It was optimization. This is what made him uniquely dangerous. Unlike Himmler, who cloaked the Holocaust in euphemisms and secrecy, Backe documented everything. His files, recovered by Allied investigators, contained detailed mortality projections, caloric deficit calculations, and regional starvation forecasts. He treated genocide like a business plan, and he believed, until the end, that his methods were justified. In a 1947 interrogation, months before his suicide, Backe was asked if he felt remorse for the deaths caused by the hunger plan. His response was chilling. "I executed the policy of the Reich. The arithmetic was sound. If the invasion had succeeded, history would have vindicated me." No apology, no denial, just cold, bureaucratic certainty. Psychologists who studied his case noted a phenomenon they termed administrative evil, the capacity of ordinary individuals to commit atrocities when mediated by systems, hierarchies, and paperwork. Backe never saw the children dying in Leningrad. He never walked through the Ukrainian villages his policies depopulated. He signed papers, he attended meetings, he optimized supply chains, and 4.2 million people died. But there's a deeper pathology at work. Backe's hatred of the Soviet Union wasn't just ideological, it was personal. His experiences in revolutionary Russia had traumatized him. He witnessed violence against Germans. He saw the old order collapse. The hunger plan was, in part, revenge, a methodical, bureaucratic act of vengeance against the people he held responsible for his childhood trauma. The Nazis understood this. They elevated Backe precisely because his hatred was clinical, not hysterical. He could engineer mass death without the emotional volatility of men like Reinhard Heydrich or Ernst Röhm. He was the perfect functionary for a regime that industrialized murder, and after the war, the Allies didn't know what to do with him. April 1947, Nuremberg. The trials of the major war criminals were concluding. Hermann Göring had been sentenced to death. Albert Speer was headed to Spandau prison. But Herbert Backe's name never appeared on the primary indictment. Why? The official explanation: lack of evidence. The hunger plan documents were scattered across Soviet archives. The Western Allies didn't have access to them, and the few Wehrmacht officers who could testify about Backe's role were either dead, in Soviet custody, or unwilling to cooperate. But the declassified truth is more disturbing. The Americans and British weren't interested in prosecuting agricultural genocide. The Nuremberg tribunal focused on the Holocaust, the gas chambers, the Einsatzgruppen, the death camps. The systematic starvation of Soviet civilians didn't fit the narrative. It was too diffuse, too bureaucratic, too easily dismissed as collateral damage from a failed military campaign. And there was another reason: realpolitik. By 1947, the Cold War was beginning. The Western Allies needed Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. Prosecuting a German official for starving Russians would complicate post-war reconstruction. Better to let it fade into the historical background. So Backe sat in a Nuremberg holding cell, waiting for a trial that would never come. He knew the evidence against him was overwhelming. His own documents condemned him. But he also knew that the geopolitical winds were shifting. If he could delay long enough, the Western Allies might lose interest. He might survive. He was wrong. April 6, 1947. Shortly after 3 a.m., a guard conducting routine checks found Herbert Backe hanging from a pipe in his cell. He had used handkerchiefs tied together and looped over toilet equipment. The knot was expertly tied. Death was instantaneous. The official investigation ruled it suicide. No foul play, no suspicious circumstances. But the timing was peculiar. Backe had been scheduled for interrogation that afternoon. The topic: the hunger plan's implementation in Ukraine. Soviet prosecutors had finally provided the Western Allies with captured Wehrmacht documents, explicitly linking Backe to starvation orders. The trial was imminent. He would have been the first Nazi official prosecuted specifically for agricultural genocide, and then he was dead. Some historians believe Backe committed suicide to avoid the humiliation of a public trial. Others argue he was murdered, either by former SS officers who feared he would implicate them, or by Allied intelligence agents who wanted to bury the hunger plan's connections to Western complicity. The evidence is inconclusive, but the result was the same. Herbert Backe escaped justice. His crimes were never formally adjudicated, and for 70 years his name remained obscure, a footnote in the history of the Third Reich, until the Soviet archives opened. 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed. The KGB's classified archives were transferred to the Russian Federal Security Service. Western historians gained access to millions of documents that had been sealed since 1945. And buried in the files was the original hunger plan. The document was titled Economic Policy Guidelines for Economic Organization East, 23 pages, signed by Herbert Backe, countersigned by Hermann Göring, dated May 23, 1941. The language was explicit, not euphemistic, not coded. It stated in unambiguous terms that many tens of millions of people in this territory will become superfluous and will have to die or emigrate to Siberia. It outlined the exact regions to be depopulated. It specified the caloric deficits that would ensure mass starvation. It projected mortality rates with actuarial precision, and it contained a sentence that historians now regard as one of the most chilling statements in 20th century history. The German people's food supply stands above all else. The eastern territories will be used to relieve the situation. This will undoubtedly result in the death of millions of people. Death, not as a consequence, as a goal. The discovery of the hunger plan forced a historical reckoning. Scholars began to recognize that the Holocaust, horrific as it was not the Third Reich's only genocide. The systematic starvation of Soviet civilians was equally deliberate, equally lethal, and equally driven by Nazi racial ideology. But unlike the Holocaust, which has been exhaustively documented and memorialized, the hunger plan remained obscure. Why? Because the victims were Soviet citizens, because the perpetrators died before they could be prosecuted, and because the Western Allies, for political reasons, chose not to prioritize it. But the numbers are undeniable. Historians now estimate that the hunger plan and its associated policies killed 4.2 million Soviet civilians between 1941 and 1944. Not soldiers, civilians, mothers, children, elderly, starved by design. And the architect of this atrocity, Herbert Backe, died without ever answering for it. Herbert Backe's story is not a tale of redemption. There is no moral lesson, no final twist that reveals hidden humanity. He was a man who reduced genocide to arithmetic, who treated mass death as a policy outcome, and who escaped justice through suicide. But his legacy is a warning. The Holocaust is remembered because it was industrialized, because the gas chambers and crematoria were so viscerally horrifying that their existence demanded acknowledgement. The hunger plan is forgotten because it was bureaucratic. It didn't require death camps. It required spreadsheets. It didn't require executioners. It required administrators. And that's the terrifying truth. The greatest atrocities are often committed not by fanatics, but by technocrats, by men in suits who optimize logistics, who calculate acceptable losses, who treat human beings as variables in an equation. Herbert Backe was never a household name like Hitler or Himmler. He never gave speeches at Nuremberg rallies. He never wore an SS uniform in public. But his signature on a single document killed more people than the Einsatzgruppen ever could. He weaponized hunger. He industrialized starvation. And he did it all with the cold efficiency of a mid-level bureaucrat filing quarterly reports. The Soviets called him one of the greatest criminals of all time. The Western Allies let him die in obscurity. History forgot him. But the 4.2 million corpses his policies created remember. The hunger plan was not a secret. Wehrmacht officers knew. Reichsmarschall Göring knew. Adolf Hitler knew. And Herbert Backe, the agricultural economist from Georgia who watched Bolsheviks dismantle the old order, engineered it all. He died before he could testify. His documents were buried in Soviet archives for 50 years, and when they were finally declassified, the world had moved on. But the lesson endures. Genocide doesn't require hatred. It requires indifference. It requires men like Herbert Backe, who looked at millions of people and saw only numbers, and that is the most dangerous kind of evil. Thanks for watching.